All right. I believe we have critical mass. John, you want to get started?
Yep. So I added this kind of aspirationally, hoping that I would finish writing the doc before the meeting, which didn't happen. So we more have my notes about the doc that I intended to write, but since we had nothing else on the agenda, I figured I'd keep it here and get some early feedback. So the general idea, we have this workload XDS API that we use for ztunnel, and we're starting to use it in some places for metadata information for Envoy as well, for telemetry and whatnot. That was not the most thoroughly designed API. It was mostly stick what we need and then we'll evolve it because we haven't launched yet, right? So that was never really intended to be the final API, just the API we had at the time. So since then, we've discovered quite a few gaps in it. I tried to identify what those are here. My main goal of this meeting really is to make sure that these actually address all the cases that we've run into. So I would love feedback on other things that are kind of missing in the API that we need to consider. And then the intent after, once this is ready, is to have kind of the next revision of the API. I doubt it will be the final revision, so we're probably not locked in yet, but hopefully we'll at least tide us over for a few months before we need to make some big revisions again, if at all. So the general idea, let me go over the gaps. So one gap today is we don't have a service representation. We actually have each workload just has a list of service IP addresses that they're a part of. And then we kind of aggregate those together to form like this service definition. That makes it hard to implement things on service. So for example, there's like session affinity as part of service. We don't really have a way to attach that unless we inline it into every workload, which is kind of weird. Also, I guess put this down here. Kind of along the same lines, in our metrics, there's a few keys or labels that are related to service. They have like the service name and namespace. Today, those are the only fields that we don't support in the metrics reporting because we don't know about, we don't know about any of the service info. We just have the IP address, which it's asking for the name, not the IP address. Some other issues with service is that service can actually have endpoints in it that aren't pods, but because we look at pods and then kind of reverse engineer the service, we just ignore those entirely. So if you add some endpoints to a service, those will never be selected by ztunnel. Kind of similarly, the readiness logic is not exactly accurate. Like we try and recreate the readiness logic of service, but it's not. I don't know all the gaps. I know at least one that there's this publish not ready addresses in service, so we definitely don't handle that. There's probably other ones as well. Service is pretty complicated. And then finally, we have a list of waypoint IP addresses. And in the future, I guess that's actually a gap. I shouldn't say in the future when we're talking about gaps. Okay, well, we have a list of waypoint IP addresses. That's like the actual pod IP of the waypoints. So I do have some concerns that scaling up and down waypoints, we're suddenly going to need to push out a lot of information of all the workloads that are selected by those. And then there's more like next hops than just a waypoint. For example, on cross network traffic, we may need to traverse an east-west gateway to reach it, not just a waypoint. We don't currently represent that at all. So right now, just focusing on the gaps, I have some proposals below, obviously, but I wanted to get feedback on this, see if there's things missing. These aren't real problems, whatever.
Hey, John, a couple thoughts that come to mind as I've spent time over the last few weeks diving into the workloads API is IP is kind of a top level definition, right? And all the information of a workload is kind of sorted by IP address, right? So we got the key as the IP for the map and the value being the structured type of the workload, right? And so I'm just trying to think like how this works across different clusters, right? And so if we want to do multi-cluster stuff and we've got cluster A and B that have overlapping IPs, how does this API work in that scenario? And I guess what I'm getting to is, should we start thinking about like the API being like cluster aware, trust domain aware?
Yeah, so I think that is a valid concern. One thing on the terminology, not to nitpick, but just so we're on the same page. So in Istio, different clusters may be on the same network. Like the boundary is really the network, not the cluster. Network is kind of the IP space boundary in Istio, at least in our made-up terminology.
Yeah,
I totally valid concern.
Separate networks, yeah,
no
you.
problem. Yeah. So I totally agree. I definitely agree that's a gap. I have some ideas on how we can solve that. I don't think it's too far off, which we can get into if we want, but definitely valid. Thanks for pointing that out.
Another area of the API too. Again, I'm still new to this, coming up to speed, but the gateway address. Trying to understand. Looking at the code, it looks like the gateway address gets set, but it's not. When you look at the configuration of a ztunnel, you don't see it set, and there's. How can we kind of disambiguate or better understand what that gateway address is? Obviously the waypoint addresses, to me, it makes sense, but the gateway address is something that I just don't understand what that is used for.
Yeah, so that gateway address actually isn't in the workload API that's served over XDS. That's the in-memory representation, which is mostly just a weird legacy hangover from POC we did like 2 years ago when that was how we first implemented it. So I agree. Like the general idea was that it was supposed to be the kind of next hop or like how you reach it, which could be a waypoint, but it could also be an east-west gateway, for example. Or maybe in the future, if we represent something like google.com, it could be an egress gateway. That's a bit hand wavy on that for sure. We haven't thought about egress that much, but that's generally the idea. But that's kind of, to some extent, separate from the XDS API. Although I think given that like this one that we need to represent the east-west gateway, that may be the API we end up with anyways, and then remove waypoint addresses and make it more generic. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going at. Is like with waypoint addresses and gateway address. It seems to me like if a waypoint address is defined, that's essentially the next hop for the destination of that workload IP, right? So maybe it just makes sense to have gateway addresses being plural, and then if it's a waypoint or an east-west gateway or whatever it might be, that becomes the destination or next hop for the destination workload IP.
Yep, definitely. I don't think that there's a case where you need to know the waypoint and the east-west gateway. I believe we can consolidate to one field. Have to think about it more, but that seems plausible. Any other gaps?
Not a gap, but just kind of curious what your thoughts were with respect to handling endpoints for a service. Like, did you want to kind of separate it and chunk it kind of like they did with endpoint slice, or you thinking about just having it one monolithic structure?
Yeah, so let me, I guess, go into the proposal, and it should answer that question pretty quickly. This is not fleshed out. I'll update it with like a proper proto with a diff of what we have, but the general idea is we would add a new type that's a service, and this service would basically today contain just like the name, namespace, and host name of the service, so we can fulfill the metrics requirement. In the future, it would also have things like, whether this is cross mesh or cluster local or session affinity or not, or whatever settings we need to do to fulfill this full service API requirement. since we don't actually implement those in ztunnel, that'd probably be deferred. And we can continue adding fields as we need to, get through all the aspects. Put this in a different order. I think that it makes sense to have I do have a proto here. Let me just copy it in real quick. A top level message, I call address here, but we can obviously bike-shed the name, that kind of aggregates both workloads and services. The reason I think this is useful is oh, sorry, can you scroll down to this code block? Thanks. Yeah, the reason I think this is useful is it allows us to have a way for ztunnel to say, I got this IP address, now what is it? And send a request to the control plane and to kind of do on-demand routing. So if we had separate XDS resources for a service and workload that are subscribed to directly, we'd have to kind of do a weird request for this IP as a workload and as a service, and then kind of race them, I guess, and see which one wins, which could be done, but it's kind of awkward. So having just a single type that kind of is one of each of them, I think may be useful. But we could also allow, we could have East2D expose address as kind of an aggregated type, and then workload and service. If something only cares about workloads, for example, I don't know. Well, we'd have to think through the use cases, but just the idea there. And then, so on service, if you scroll down a bit, ignore the route for now. That one's less. Let me actually just remove it. I don't want to add confusion. On service, we have, just like I mentioned, name, namespace, host name, address, ports. Nothing too controversial there, I think. We'll extend it, obviously, with some fields later, as I mentioned. Does this make sense so far? I don't want to talk for 30 minutes if no one's following.
No, this is really interesting.
Okay, cool. If you can scroll back up, sorry.
Just,
okay.
For terminology, workload historically just means just a binary, right, running somewhere. I wonder if from the perspective of the client, if endpoint makes more sense. I'm not sure the distinction between endpoint and workload.
I mean, it might, naming is hard, obviously. The one thing that may be confusing is in Kubernetes, an endpoint is the joining of a service and a workload. That forms an endpoint, but you could have a workload without a service at all, right? We could call it endpoint. It may make sense in other contexts. If you're purely coming from Kubernetes context, it may be confusing in that regard. That's what we call a service instance in the internal pilot model.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that these are necessarily the ideal names. Just that may be a concern with endpoints. I'm very happy to have better naming suggestions than here. I'm not a namer. So to answer kind of Nate's initial question, though, so I think for workloads, we would keep it largely the same as we do today. Oh, I guess one gap I forgot. Workloads are only based on pods. We don't actually do any workload entry, service entry, anything like that. So we kind of have no VM support, which was just largely an implementation limitation that was never intentional plan or anything. So for workloads, though, we would look at all of the sources for workloads we have. That's pods, workload entries, and actually endpoints themselves. And we'd kind of do a join across those by IP address. So if we have a pod or workload entry by that IP address, we'd obviously take that information and populate all the fields of workload. So that's the name, namespace, trust domain, all the good stuff. That's what we already do, except for workload entry would be new, of course. The kind of newer thing would be that we also look at endpoints, which could be from endpoints, endpoint slices, or kind of our synthesized endpoints by joining service and workload entry or service entry and pods, which don't exist in endpoints in the API server, but they're kind of logically equivalent in Istio. And then also join those with IP address. So if the IP is already a pod or a workload, which is kind of the normal case, then we would use that to add the VIPs field to the workloads. So this handles the case where service readiness is not properly respected. So instead of trying to recreate that kind of service selecting pod logic in the workload XDS, we wouldn't do that at all. We'd actually look at the endpoints and say, okay, here's an endpoint for this service. It's associated with this pod, and then we'd kind of do the join there. That way we don't have to be in the business of dealing with like the readiness logic for, okay, is this pod and this service actually associated together? Which is more complicated than just the label selects the pod. So that will give roughly the same behavior in most cases, but if there's edge cases that, like that weird publish not ready addresses or whatnot, we would still get the VIPs properly. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that we may have endpoints where we don't have pods. I don't feel amazing about this, but my current proposal is that we would still create a workload and it would just be missing a lot of information. So in the endpoint, we get some info, like we would definitely have namespace and IP address. That might be it. I mean, I have to go through the full thing, but we wouldn't have service account. We wouldn't have names, workload version. So it'd be a very bare bones workload. It would always be TCP, of course, because we don't know if it supports HPhone or not. So we'd have these very like minimal representations of these workloads that have been synthetically added to endpoints by the user. So I forget what your original question was, Nate, but I thought this would answer it. So let me know if it didn't or if this makes sense.
I forgot what it was too, but this was great.
Okay. Yeah. Does anyone have opinions about this? Especially this highlighted part was one that I feel like it makes sense, but it's also kind of weird to have these kind of very bare bones workloads and making all these fields basically optional.
So the idea of that is if someone accesses the IP directly?
So in an endpoint today, or usually it's endpoint slices because like you can manually configure the endpoints, right? And put IP addresses there that aren't pods. So if someone has a service, we should still be sending traffic to those endpoints. Otherwise, like we'll be giving different routing behavior. But we don't know much about those endpoints. Like we effectively just know the namespace and the IP address and whatever else is in endpoints, which is not very much info, right?
Yeah, got it.
Yeah. So if a user sent directly to those IP addresses, like there would be no different routing information because we don't have, we would never upgrade to HPhone because we don't have enough info to know if it's HPhone or not. And we have basically no additional metadata for telemetry. The difference would be if they access the service, we would start sending traffic to those when previously they're just ignored entirely.
That makes sense.
Okay, I think the last thing, well, one, we talked a bit about this before, but it probably makes sense to replace waypoint addresses with something like more generic, like gateway or next hop or whatever we want to call it. That's kind of more generic than, just waypoint. I don't know, we can bike shed the naming, but something along those lines that's more generic. And I think it also makes sense to replace the list of IPs with a VIP. That way we don't have to change it every time a waypoint scales up or down. We just have a stable VIP. And as it scales up and down, it's no problem. Now the Z-tunnel wouldn't literally send it to that VIP. It would be smart enough to look at the VIP and say, okay, here's this VIP. I also know this VIP is actually the waypoint service. That waypoint service has these workloads associated, so I'm going to load balance across those workloads. Which I think when I described that, it sounded complicated, but it's pretty simple in the actual implementation. And so it's basically just like a key into the service, which has a list of workloads rather than sending the whole list there. Yeah.
Hey, John, I just want to make sure I understand that last point that you made. So you're suggesting using the service VIP as a key for the workload map instead of the pod or the workload IP.
In the waypoint's address. So we would say like today we say waypoint address is like pod IP. And now we say waypoint address is VIP.
Gotcha. Yep.
Ethan?
John, would it be like a real VIP? Would we actually put the waypoints in a Kubernetes service? And
yeah, the plan, and there's a PR to do this already, is that we'll expose a service for the waypoint.
okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Oh, that's interesting because today there's no service object. It's only the deployments today, right? So you.
Yes, that is true today. There is a PR that adds the service already.
Okay, cool. So John, I have, so first of all, I mean, the proposal looks really, really interesting. Certainly we didn't have a lot of time to digest, so we probably ask stupid questions. I want to second what Damon was mentioned earlier. The key by IP address has becoming a problem for some of the scenarios, particularly as you're looking into beyond one single cluster on different network, right? You could have maybe some of the workloads are represented as the same IP address. So that definitely is an important scenario for us. And then I have a general question about this XDS evolution. Are you proposing the change for zTunnel, or are you also proposing some of these workload XDS impacting waypoint as well?
Yeah, so today, the zTunnel obviously exclusively uses this API for configuration. There's been some work, let me send a link on the doc, of using the workload API for getting metadata for telemetry instead of doing metadata exchange, which this would be, all of this would not make that worse, I think. That's still a bit under discussion in general, I think, but I think that usage would be compatible. In the distant future, potentially we could use this API for routing in the waypoint as well if we find a way to do that and it's useful. But today we still use the old, just LDS, RDS, etc. for routing in waypoint. So I'm not proposing here that we use this for routing in Envoy, but I don't think this makes it any worse if we were to do that in the future.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
So going back to your other comment, the IP address reuse, you are just talking about the standard case that an IP, like the key to a resource is actually IP plus network, not IP, right? Not something else.
Yeah, so imagine if you have, let's say if you have workloads, you have two workloads running on a remote cluster, right? If you are running multi-network, those two workloads on the remote cluster is going to be represented by the same IP, right? Because it's hopping through the Istio ingress gateway on the remote cluster. Yeah, has been a problem for us.
Yeah, so I have some ideas for how we solve that. I'll try and explain it here, but I don't think I'm going to represent it well because I haven't really thought through how to explain it. But so one of the things that I've been trying to do is to keep the key to an IP address so that when zTunnel gets a request, it can say, what is this IP address, right? And so when it gets a request, it doesn't know anything other than the IP address in, I guess, the port. So the only thing we could key on for that is the IP address. However, we know that when a zTunnel gets a request from an outbound request, it's going to the same network, right? We're not expecting to see, if a pod says curl 1234, that by definition is 1234 in my own network. So what I was thinking was that in XDS, you can actually have aliases for a type. So the full key would be network/IP. And then we would allow zTunnel to also query just by the IP, which implicitly means the same network. Actually, now that I'm typing this out, there's actually no need for that. The zTunnel can always just request its own network name/IP. So maybe this is all too complicated. And we just make the key the network and the IP. zTunnel knows that it's almost always going to request its own network when it's doing on-demand lookup. Sorry if I don't know if this made any sense. It was a really train of thought.
But how would that work though? Because your remote network could be on the same network, right? Let's say your remote cluster is on remote cluster network. You would have remote cluster / east-west gateway IP for workload A and B that I was just mentioned.
Remote network could be on the same network.
Well, remote network is the same for workload A and B on the remote cluster, right? So So your key is the same for workload A and B on the remote cluster because they're on the same network. They also have the same IP as the east-west gateway.
I think the issue is that you're saying that workload A and B, you set their IP as the east-west gateway.
Yeah, but
not-
just imagine they are the workloads you're trying to reach. The client runs in maybe cluster 1, and then you have a remote cluster, which you have 2 of your destinations.
Yeah, I mean, how do we support overlapping IPs, right?
But I think that's like not how workloads are represented. Like I think what you're saying is that is this what you're saying? Like, let's say we have east-west gateway. The IP address is 2345, right? And it's in network A, and the workload has this IP address. I think what you're saying is that you want to represent all these workloads in this remote network as having the IP address of the gateway.
Because that's how the routes happens, right? The hop goes to the gateway first, and then
Yeah, but it's kind of this is not the IP address of the workload. This is the IP address of the gateway.
yeah, but with the isolated control plane, right? You don't know the actual IP on the remote clusters pods, right? With the isolated, so you only know the gateway, east-west gateway IP.
Yeah, I feel like what you want is actually this scenario. You have a workload, but you don't know what its IP address is. You know its gateway, you know its network. And is that all you know about it, actually? Do you know anything else? The service account?
Service account,
Yes.
probably you need that to do validation, yes.
When you actually represent this in like Istio today, do you have a workload entry for each one, or do you have a workload entry with a weight that changes depending on how many?
That's a good question.
Single with a weight.
Eitan, you probably know the answer best.
Yeah, a single with a weight.
Okay. Yeah, so I think this is a case that we should consider. So I'll get to Costin next in case he has a better suggestion. But I think representing it as the IP address is the gateway is probably not how we want to represent it. And instead, it's more the IP address is unknown, and this is the gateway. But then we have this issue where we don't actually have a key.
Yeah.
Now, so we probably need a new key format for like unknown IP or something. I'll definitely take that into consideration. I don't have any concrete ideas right now. Go ahead, Costin.
Well, I do have one, and I think we discussed it. It's thank you so much for these ideas.
You're breaking up.
Oh,
Yeah, you're roboting pretty bad.
sorry, I had some head that didn't work.
Yeah, much better.
So,
Maybe disable your video. See if
Yeah, Costin, you're still roboting.
Sorry, we can't hear you at all. I think Kevin had some interesting comment using UUID and network in the chat.
The UUID of what exactly?
Is it the pod, Kevin? Why don't you speak up?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking the pod itself or the workload entry, the service entry, every resource that gets written to at CD has a UID. So that is sure is globally unique. It might be overkill. My primary thought was to your first point, John, about if we had a missing IP, how do we handle the keying? And my thought would be to kind of delineate all workloads that we know about, basically like workloads we consent to from ones that we can receive from, right? Because like IPs are, even in the question mark IP, that's never going to be our source IP, right? So it's only a valid destination.
Yeah.
So you can still look up from IP if you make the delineation of like, this is my group of pod IPs that can reach me local to the node. And then the destination could be unknown. That's fine.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like we could certainly do something like Like this is the workload unknown IP address. When the IP address is unknown, the key is not the IP. It's actually UID plus network. UID could come from workload or something. The actual key doesn't really matter, that because on this case, we would never be looking these up. Like we're never getting a request with this unknown IP, obviously, because we don't know what the IP is. So we never have to do on-demand lookups, right? This would always be something that's pushed by the control plane. So what the key is doesn't actually matter. It seems to be static so that we can correlate them between requests, right? So I think UID would work fine there. Or really anything that's just stable and unique is sufficient. And I do like the point on source workloads and destination workloads. I don't know if that's like something we would treat differently in the actual API itself, or just like know that unknown IPs are kind of destination only. I have to think that through a bit.
Yeah, I'm back.
Qasim, did you? Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm back. So what I was trying to say is that a pod name is probably the right approach here. It also works with multiple networks and mostly satisfies most of the requirements. Keep in mind, we also may have the use case of persistent sessions. So we need some way to represent basically the pod. We cannot just put multiple pods behind a single IP. We need some way to identify. UUID is pretty ugly and not intuitive. And, why would you use an UUID when you have a host name and you can also represent the namespace cluster and have full, FQDN that makes sense and can be used in other places. I think it's a very important use case, and it would be wonderful if the discovery system and everything would have dual mode where you can use either host names, which would be the fully qualified domain name with pod ID namespace and some cluster specific extension, or the IPs with the first use in any multi-network situation, because IPs will no longer be unique. Yeah, that was my point. Sorry for the audio.
Okay, that makes sense. It actually brings me to one question I had concretely. Does anyone see a need for their gateways, which now means waypoints or east-west gateways, to be DNS names, or do we only care about supporting IP addresses? Because we'll obviously need a different schema if we want DNS names.
Well, isn't the AWS cloud only support host name based for the gateway?
For GCP.
AWS does only support host name. In Istio, we have like Istio doing the DNS resolution and converting IPs.
Steven added that code.
Yeah, I mean, really, that's not amazing. I'm not no offense to you at all, Steven. Like that's the best we can do. But given this is zTunnel, we can easily make it. If we wanted to support that, we could make zTunnel do the DNS, right? It's easier to add that extensibility than in Envoy.
Is not that, John, in Google, there is one IP shared by multiple tenants, and host name is using as SNI. If you don't put the right SNI, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So with some custom changes, host name not only as a way to resolve IP, but also as a way to indicate the SNI in the TLS negotiation.
Yeah, that's true. Do you see a use case for that in Google? Because I thought I asked you this yesterday and you said no. Or you're saying in general?
No. For serverless integration, for example, and some other product integration, definitely.
Yeah.
We have a prototype already using the first version of zTunnel, or whatever it was called, to integrate with Cloud Run, was using this kind of SNI override.
But is that for waypoints and gateways, or are you saying we should also have that for workloads and or services?
This case, it was for to connect to individual pod equivalent running in a Cloud Run environment.
Yeah. So to support that, we would actually need that would actually be something on the workload itself, not on the gateway, right?
Yes, but there are different degrees of integration, different ways to integrate. I mean, all of them will be useful. I think we can make it work with either. If we have all of them, it's wonderful, of course. But we need to put host names more into the product. That's my the general point. Because SNI is very important, and any multi-tenancy, we cannot assume anyone can get an IP address, IPv4 address freely anytime they want for free.
Okay, so it sounds like we potentially want it in the gateway at next hop, can be an IP or host name, but we also may want to have the ability for workloads to not have IP based, but be based on a host name.
Yeah, any massive multi-tenant will require this because again, IPs are expensive.
Yeah, one thing that's tricky, if you're doing, like, let's say you have Cloud Run, you have a host name for it, not an IP address, and it's part of a service, you call the service and then we send to the Cloud Run, that works fine. But if a user directly sends to the workload, like the Cloud Run service, we won't be able to match it, right? Because we only see the IP address.
Yeah, that's it can be addressed. I mean, let's not take Cloud Run as an example, but there are many cases where SNI based routing can be used, or the gateway can terminate and do persistent session equivalent. Because we may need to put the pod also in the one of the headers to have a more secure persistent session model. With IP can be reallocated, and it's very complicated to have a cookie that includes IPs that may soon be replaced. But pod names are a bit more persistent.
Okay, I think that in the short term, we probably, for workload not being IP based, we may need to think through that a bit more. Like, I see the use case, I'm just not sure how we'd represent it. I think allowing DNS names in the gateway address is pretty easy to do now, though. So I'd be perfectly fine implementing that. I don't know how hard it will be to do DNS in zTunnel. Hopefully not so hard. But we can always delay the implementation anyways and update the API to be future-proof if we need. Any other comments? I see nothing else has been added to the agenda, so we can keep talking if we want, or anything. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I was wondering, or maybe just remind me real quick at it. Why did we want to represent the IP as like unknown and use a gateway? Like, was there a use case where we might want to hit a waypoint before going remote? Right, like there was an idea earlier to reuse the waypoint, like turn that waypoint addresses into like a gateways. And I guess I was wondering if it makes sense to leave that as waypoints, right? If it's in another network, we know that the IP probably is nonsense anyways. So is there a good reason to make it unknown? Or I was wondering that rationale.
I guess what would it be if it wasn't unknown?
Oops, I didn't mean to raise my hand again. Oh, if it was back to like if it was the East-West gateway, like if you had a lot of IPs just in different networks or they were duplicated.
Yeah.
But you knowing that it's in another network, you know that IP is not actually reachable in your network.
That's, if this was, let me copy this so I don't mangle this one. If we had this config, I actually had that above. This is actually useful. Both IPs are useful because we can request, even though this IP is on a different network, we could request this through the East-West gateway at this IP address and say, I want this specific IP address on the other network. This could be useful for like stateful sets, for example, right? Or I want to access a specific instance of a workload on another network. That's something HPhone allows us because we have that metadata. Now, in this case, you don't actually know the IP addresses on the other network. You just have a weight of what's behind the network because you have like a split brain-ish control plane. So obviously you can't do that. But for the general purpose, even the standard Istio multi-network, we actually do know the IPs there, so they can be used.
Okay, awesome. That makes sense.
Kevin, whoever. Yeah, so I think if you have the IPs, like it's useful to be there. And it's also useful to know, I think, that we don't know the IP, because then in the HPhone request, we need to request something, right? And we talked about in that multi-network one, for the case when we don't have IPs, we would instead put like the host name. So like if we don't, that would allow us to say like, okay, if we don't know the IP, put the host name instead. Otherwise, we wouldn't really know. Like if we had the, I guess we could say like gateway IP equals IP, then do that or something. It's just a little funky. So I would definitely need to like scope this out more concretely, but I think this is kind of closing most of the gaps, I hope. Like I said, this is like very much rough draft, so I plan to put this together a lot more thoroughly, and we'll obviously have folks review it again, take some time to digest this and whatnot.
Yeah, that sounds good. So what Costin was suggesting earlier, I think it was pod name. So how would that work for the pods that are running on the remote cluster where you don't necessarily know the name of the pods?
No, that's for if you do know the names. If you don't know the names, then you don't
Then
know
you
the names.
just use the host name? Potentially.
No, it's a service. Then you hit the service and you use the service name as host name.
Yeah, so these, I don't know, we'd have to come up with a name for this. These like unknown workloads, you can't access them directly. You can only access them through a service. So we could use the service host name in the request.
Okay, yeah, sounds good.
Which is how browsers typically work. I mean, if you connect to google.com, you use www.google.com, that's kind of the host name. It's a service or a cluster deep in Kubernetes. But if you want to talk specifically to a pod because you have a persistent session or you have a stateful set or whatever, then you need to know either the host name or the IP address. You cannot talk with someone if you don't know the address.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, service in this case means abstract service, not Kubernetes service.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
maybe we should come up with different names. I mean, like service as in the new message type. That's service or service entry.
FQDM.
Got it.
And then a workload is, a workload entry or a pod.
Makes sense.
To confirm, are we planning to implement this with the current east-west SNI-based gateway to Mangling, or are we planning to implement it as Z-tunnel-like or Envoy using H1?
No, this is the double H-bone discussion that we had in the multi-network.
Okay.
So to be clear, I don't actually intend to implement any of that multi-network stuff in the short term. This is just, we'll enable that longer term when someone thinks that multi-network's a priority.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is just a proposal at the moment. There is no implementation plan, or do you mean you plan?
No,
to
all this will be
implement
implemented,
API?
but the multi-network aspects of like doing the double H-bone, sending to an east-west gateway, at least I don't personally plan to implement that. Right? We had kind of said, here's how we're going to do it. We'll do the double H-bone and XYZ, but we'll defer that until it's a priority.
Okay, so
but most of this stuff is not actually about multi-network. This is solving a bunch of short-term use cases.
Okay, got it. Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Volunteers welcome.
I think you have a question, which I don't understand what NH is.
Oh, and next hop.
Oh yeah, actually that's a good point. We may need next hop to. We may need some more info than just address, because we behave differently if it's the next hop is a waypoint or an east-west gateway. So maybe we have two fields or an enum on the field or something.
Can you have waypoint support H-bone and the east-west gateway does not? I guess east-west gateway would also support H-bone with double H-bone. So
yeah, but we may not need to do double encryption, or we may. I'd have to. I don't know the exact differences, but I'm pretty sure that there will be some case when we need to distinguish between the two.
yeah, okay, yeah, fair.
Well, maybe 3 or 4 at the end of the day, so probably we'll need a protocol type or encoding or transport or tunneling.
Yeah, so I think we'll need more than just address. We'll definitely probably make it a message that we can extend with more fields in the future as we need, and have IP. Probably port today we assume it's 15,008, but we probably want to allow other ports. I think it's useful for east-west gateway. Actually, like the default would probably not even be 15,008 for east-west gateway, since we already have the port exposed, the 15.443.1 or whatever. Daniel?
Yeah, I just want to go back to a point that you were making earlier about using a service to front end the waypoint, no longer using the waypoint pod IPs.
Yep.
So in that case, we could represent multiple waypoint pods using a service, and then each of those waypoint pods would have a workload entry, and then there would be a service entry.
You don't need
for
those,
the
right?
waypoint.
You don't need a workload or service entry. It's just a Kubernetes service rep and the Kubernetes deployment for those waypoints.
And the service entry. not
Well, you don't
work.
need a service entry Istio type. You just need
Yeah,
a
why-
Kubernetes
why-
service.
Yeah, why do you need a service entry? Because if it's inside of your cluster.
Mesh internal, that's how we use. I think the normal way to represent services is to a service entry. Workload entry is for individual entry. I mean, they do the same thing, but conceptually they are, if you want to represent the service, normally I would use service entry.
Maybe I was confused. So Daniel, are you referring to the waypoint maybe on a different cluster?
No, I'm just trying to think. So zTunnel needs to forward to a waypoint, and now it's forwarding to a service IP, a VIP, instead of a pod IP.
Yes.
So that's
Yeah, go
just in the API model. So instead of, it's basically just, do we have the control plane take the service and convert it to a list of pod IPs, or do we just push the service and then let zTunnel do it? So it will still actually go take the VIP, look at all the workloads in it, which already has this information for other service routing purposes, and send directly to pod IPs using whatever load balancing it wants. So it's more just the API. The actual runtime behavior, it will still send directly to pod IPs.
Okay, and that's what I was trying to understand. Is it actually
Yeah.
doing the endpoint discovery for the VIP and then load balancing to the IPs, or is it sending it just directly to the VIP?
Yeah, I would expect, I mean, in theory, it could send to the VIP, but I don't see why. I think we can do things better by sending directly to the pods. Like we already do that for everything else anyways. So all the logic's already in zTunnel and whatnot for that.
So if you can send directly to the pod, send directly to the pod because it's most optimal.
Yeah.
In some cases,
Yeah.
you cannot. East-west, for example, I mean, multi-network, you cannot by definition. So you have to send to a VIP effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Basically, like the general zTunnel routing is like, make the smartest decision I can. If the next hop is smarter, defer the decision. If I'm the last hop, then I have to make the decision, right? So, if there's a waypoint in front, then we don't want to resolve to a specific bit. Well, anyhow, I think that I don't think I'm explaining this well.
No, we got it. So
Yeah,
basically,
yeah.
there's no need for service entry or workload entry, which is great, right? For the user, they automatically going to get improvements if they deploy more than one replica of their waypoints, right?
Yeah.
So zTunnel will help choose which is the right pod endpoint of the waypoint to send to. With this
Yeah, actually, I mean, it does that today. It's just the representation is not as efficient. But I think we already support multiple waypoints in zTunnel today. So
I'm glad we discovered how routing worked internet. Maybe it's BGP.
yeah, so one of the other things too, by the way, this is not actually the XDS API, but it's related to the VIP on like the service association with gateway. Today we have like this logic where we look at a gateway, like a gateway is a representation of the waypoint, but then we rely on some internal details that, okay, a gateway means that we're going to have pods with this label, and then we look at those pods and then we find out, all the pods to send, which is like not really, it's kind of relying on implementation details of Istio. So if some other system wanted to integrate, they wouldn't have a great way to know how to actually send traffic to the waypoint. So now that we have actually a service, it's just like how gateways work with Ingress. You create a gateway, it gets assigned some IP address that's written into the status, and now if you want to reach that, you just go to that IP address. So I don't know what exactly integrations that will help in the future, but it would allow, for example, if someone wanted to write a, custom zTunnel, for example, and didn't want to rely on implementation details, that would work. Or if, for example, I wanted to run my waypoints not as pods in the cluster, but as pods somewhere else, all I need to do is write some IP address into the status, and that would be respected. So kind of making it less Istio only one implementation specific.
Yeah, in particular with the Gamma proposal to support gateways from different vendors working together with this implementation.
Yep.
Quick question on the cluster local. Do we have agreement? Is there any objection? Should we start implementing it?
Oh, that's from last week, right?
Yes. I think that I didn't hear any objection in the bug. I think that John didn't like mesh internal. Happy to put something else, but so the idea is that by default cluster local will stay local in the internal mode, and if you use anything else, more or less it will be global. So cluster set local or something that has a representation in service entry. So you opt in by creating a service entry object for that name.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. What's the contention that you need other people to help resolve?
I think we have consensus that cluster local should be local. I think the discussion is how do we opt into the whole behavior if it's mesh wide. And there is, obviously MCS, which is not ready yet because it's alpha and still kind of not adopted very broadly. And then there are all kind of other options. But I think for short term using service entry is decent enough.
Do you want to kind of do something like I did with the MCS stuff where you kind of like, use a mesh config setting if somebody really needs things to just work as is?
I probably, yes, we'll have to, but I was thinking that the default at least should be the safe one for Z-tunnel. So if Z-tunnel, then default is that. We could override it as well to have an option per namespace to have it, but I would start simple and ask for someone to raise the issue.
Yeah, that's reasonable. But yeah, I'd say if you want to get working on it, go for it.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Can I quickly ask Stephen about if there's any update on the VM doc that we discussed last time?
You can, but he won't answer.
Okay.
Well, I've been watching that doc. I've not seen a lot of updates this week.
Okay, so it's the internal review at the moment.
Yeah, I think Stephen and Aditya are continuing to work in that direction.
Okay, appreciate that. John.
Yeah, one comment on that. That's going to highly overlap with the implementation of my doc that I discussed because it's about reading all this information and kind of aggregating it. So we should just make sure we're in sync there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, other comment also along those lines. Just kind of FYI on. We talked about using Z-tunnel in other areas, like on a VM or as a sidecar or in serverless environment. Someone contributed the changes for those. It's actually fairly small. Basically, Z-tunnel has a mode. You can say it's running in node mode or sidecar mode, and just tweaks a few minor behavior things like requesting its certificate for its own identity instead of the delegated identity and a few other things. So yeah, just an FYI in case people weren't following along with the repo. I think that may be useful.
John, if I set up a meeting, would you be willing to talk with us about the particular implication for VM work?
Yeah, I definitely just like 10-second summary is that we just need to read from workload entry, service, pod, endpoints, and aggregate them all together.
Okay.
Which is easier said than done, but it's like basically my proposal is saying we need to consider all the sources, and that's also what we need for VMs. So
Cool. One request for TOC and people who are good with names. It would be wonderful if we didn't use Z-tunnel sidecar, or because it will be very confusing for people. You can say ambient for VMs, ambient for serverless, but I would avoid the term sidecar because it's we have the old sidecars. We are telling people sidecars are not necessarily good. It's I don't know. At least for me, it's always I have a bit of confusion when I hear the.
Yeah, I
sorry.
had kind of a similar thought too. Like, I wonder if we should focus more on like the identity aspect of it, like either it's dedicated or shared or something like that, rather than getting into the old terminology.
I'm fine with either of those for sure. But do it sooner than later so we don't have an API change. Dedicated and shared sounds actually, I like that naming.
While we're at it, I still feel uncomfortable between Z-tunnel and ambient, but anyway.
Okay, thanks for the document of the sidecar Z-tunnel. We should read and comment on it if you don't like the naming or anything. I think the last thing, Keith, I don't know if you want to mention your supportability or just move to next week.
I'll just kind of toss it out there for folks to be thinking about. So I've started writing a doc on, safe mode in Istio, and Kostin brought up a great point that, Ambient has it's currently, or when it's going to be alpha, but there will likely be things within Ambient that will have different supportability levels compared to the main, like the main set of features. As far as note levels, Z-tunnel and things like that. So want to get folks thinking about kind of subdividing ambient as a mode and calling out specific things that might be experimental or support comes to mind, or even like a sandwich kind of situation. So be thinking about that, and we can discuss more next week.
Yeah, and for context, what I'm trying to achieve is, obviously we want to have Istio with only beta and stable features, but there are exceptions to the rules always. And one of the exceptions could be that Istio by default will support all the stable and beta APIs and features, but will also support ambient because, again, that's the direction we want. Ambient in the sense of interoperability being turned on and not having alpha options to turn it off.
All right, so we're a couple of minutes over. Shall we save these last two topics for next time?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yep.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, folks. Have a great week.